Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
He would go into the victims' bedrooms. He'd shine a flashlight in their eyes to blind them. He would tie them up, put blindfolds over their heads like pillowcases to make sure they couldn't see. He began by attacking only women, and then he started attacking male-female couples who were in bed together.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking they still haunt our imaginations.
True Criminals Insiders.
If you're following us on Patreon, thank you. And there'll be an exclusive extra chat following the main episode. For more than a decade, an invisible terror stalked California. A man who crept through unlocked windows, hid in gardens and watched his victims, sometimes for weeks, before striking. His crimes escalated in severity, starting out with burglary, but becoming darker, twisted, and deadlier. Between 1974 and 1986, one man was responsible for a staggering wave of burglaries, rapes, and murders, stretching from Sacramento in Northern California to Orange County south of LA. With his crimes and locations shifting over time, this criminal had many nicknames. In the Central Valley, they called him the Visalia Ransacker. Around Sacramento, he was the East Area Rapist. Down south, the original Night Stalker. But the world would eventually come to know him as the Golden State Killer.
In the late 1980s, the crimes just stopped. Decades passed. Police files gathered dust, witnesses grew old, and then science caught up. A single trace of DNA from one of the murder scenes became the key to cracking the mystery. Using a then new technique called genetic genealogy, familial DNA, detectives built a family tree from DNA profiles in public ancestry databases. A digital bloodline, if you like, which led them straight to a man no one expected, Joseph James DeAngelo. He'd been a police officer, sworn to protect the very communities he terrorised. He'd been living a quiet suburban life, raising 3 daughters, fixing motorcycles, shopping at Walmart. But it turned out, by night, he was one of the most sadistic predators in American history.
In this double special of True Criminals, we'll trace the Golden State Killer's reign of terror, how he evolved from a petty burglar to a prolific serial offender. And we'll ask the central question, what do these crimes reveal about the man behind them? Was he driven by rage, by lust, or by a pathological need to control? In both episodes, we'll speak to former FBI profiler Julia Cowley, the lead behavioural analyst on the case, who studied DeAngelo's methods, his language and psychology. We'll look in some detail at some of his most notorious crimes and ask Julia what they tell us about compulsion, control and the mind of a sadist. But before we grapple with a serial killer's psychology, we need to grapple with the scale of what he did. Martin, let's start by looking at the timeline and escalating nature of Joe DeAngelo's crimes.
The Golden State Killer's spree spanned more than a decade and stretched across California. It began in 1974 in Visalia, a small farming town in the Central Valley, where he broke into more than 100 homes. He stole small personal items, wedding rings, photos, underwear and so on, and sometimes lingered just to watch his victims sleep. In 1975, when a local man tried to stop him, the intruder shot him dead. Not long after that, the attacks shifted north to Sacramento. Up there from 1976 to 1979, he became known as the East Area Rapist, and he struck at least 50 times. He targeted middle-class suburbs, often breaking in while couples slept. He'd bind the man, rape the woman, and then vanish into the night. Whole neighbourhoods were paralysed with fear. Gun sales soared. People slept with the lights on. Dogs barked endlessly. Then in 1979, the pattern moved south. He murdered at least 10 people from Santa Barbara to Orange County.
The crimes were absolutely horrific, Martin, and there was something particularly cruel and cunning about this killer, wasn't there?
He was calculating. He studied his victims, their routines, their relationships, even the layout of their homes. He broke in ahead of time sometimes, leaving ropes, unlocking windows, moving objects. Then he'd return, usually under the cover of darkness. He'd blindfold his victims, tie them up, whisper threats which froze the blood. For couples, the cruelty was ritualised. He'd bind the man, stack dishes on his back, and warn that if he heard them rattle, he'd kill them both.
For years, police forces across California hunted him, but his crimes spanned jurisdictions, 53 crime scenes in 11 counties across the huge state, and his methods shifted too. The technology just wasn't there, and then, in 1986, the crimes stopped, and for decades no one knew why. But things changed massively in March 2018.
Yes, they did. Cold case detectives identified him through genetic genealogy, a method that had never been used to solve a major criminal case. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA to a public genealogy website and from there built an extended family tree. Piece by piece, generation by generation, the branches all led to one man, D'Angelo. By the time police finally caught him, Joseph D'Angelo was 72 years old, a retired grandfather living in Citrus Heights near Sacramento. He lived in a modest single-storey home with a manicured lawn. Neighbours described him as a bit grumpy, odd, but otherwise forgettable. He blended in perfectly, which of course was what he wanted. Surveillance confirmed it. Detectives followed him, watched him throw away a tissue, and when they matched it to DNA from multiple murder scenes, they knew. The Golden State Killer had a name: Joseph D'Angelo. He was arrested outside his home on April the 24th, 2018. After more than 40 years, the hunt was finally over.
40 years, it's such a long time for him to have been on the run, but what came next shocked the public. When he appeared in court, the man accused of decades of violence seemed frail, pathetic even, slumped in a wheelchair, mouth hanging open, staring blankly ahead.
He didn't look like a monster, certainly. He looked like someone's ageing neighbour. But prosecutors believe that feebleness was all an act, a final attempt at manipulation. The charges were monumental. 13 counts of first-degree murder, 13 counts of kidnapping with intent to commit robbery. As part of his plea deal, he also admitted to 161 uncharged offences: rapes, burglaries, assaults, acts of psychological torture, spread across 61 known victims. Each confession was another life upended, another family torn apart, another name added to the list of those who'd waited decades for justice. And when he finally spoke in court, his voice was quiet, barely a whisper, as he muttered, "I did all that." Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
California's most prolific predator had been unmasked after 40 years. Martin, why did it take so long for police to identify a suspect in this case?
Well, the crimes took place in the 70s and 80s, before any sort of DNA testing was available. but also because the crimes were varied and they took place all over California, from Sacramento to Santa Barbara in Southern California. It wasn't until the early 2000s that DNA was able to link the same man to more than 50 cases throughout that state.
Well, I suppose the haunting question is why? What prompted Joseph DeAngelo to embark on this horrific crime spree? What was the nature of his crimes? And how did he get away with them for so long? Well, there's no better person to discuss that with than our guest today, a former special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Julia Cowley worked as an FBI profiler on the Golden State Killer case, and she hosts the Consult podcast. Julia joins us now from Massachusetts. Welcome to True Criminals.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here today.
You're very welcome, Julia. I've read endless books featuring special agents and forensic scientists. How and why did you decide to pursue this line of work? And how did you end up working with the FBI's behavioural analyst unit?
Well, since a young age, I was an avid reader of true crime books. The first true crime book that I ever got my hands on was Helter Skelter. It was written by Vincent Bugliosi, who prosecuted Charles Manson and his followers for the murders of several individuals in Southern California in the late 60s. And after reading that book, I only wanted to read true crime. It was my passion, my interest, and I read all true crime books. And when I was in high school trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life, I thought, well, what do I like? I love true crime. So how can I make that a job? I want to help solve murders somehow. I just didn't know what that would look like. But then I came across a major called police science. And when I read the description, it was basically the description of forensic science, what we know today. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to work in a crime lab. I want to go into forensic science and process crime scenes, specifically homicide scenes. And so that's where I ended up doing it. Never looked back. I ended up majoring in chemistry in college. I got my master's degree in forensic science, and then I was fortunate enough to be hired by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, where I worked in the laboratory, and I was also a member of the crime scene team that would go out and process crime scenes and basically collect and preserve evidence at crime scenes. And during that time frame, I read Mindhunter by John Douglas at some point there, and I knew, I was fascinated with criminal profiling, because one of the things I would do when I would go to crime scenes, I would ask myself, what kind of person would do such a thing? Like, what kind of person are the investigators looking for? And so I got very interested in criminal profiling and the behavior behind violent crime. And so I thought, well, maybe someday I would join the FBI. And I did have a colleague at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation who was a mentor to me, and he joined the FBI a couple years before me, and he encouraged me to apply. So I did. And knowing that the behavioral analysis unit was very competitive, I might never have the opportunity to join, but I did get that opportunity. After about 10 years in the FBI, I did apply for the Crimes Against Adults unit, and I was selected. So that is my whole life story in a very short period of time.
Well, it's an interesting life story, and you're our first FBI profiler, so it's fantastic to hear that.
I guess Charlie Manson was a pretty grim but fitting starting point for your interest in true crime. Julia, for our listeners who might not be familiar with criminal profiling, can you explain what it is and perhaps what it isn't?
So, criminal profiling is not an exact science, and it's not a diagnosis. While we rely heavily on forensic psychology, we're not diagnosing anyone. We're basically looking at a crime. We're looking at the interaction between an offender and a victim, or offenders and victims. And we're trying to make an assessment and glean certain characteristics about that offender based on what we're seeing between the interactions between the offenders and the victims. So it is what I like to call it, and I am stealing this term from a friend of mine, a former law enforcement officer, who called it investigative enhancement. So criminal profiling, it doesn't identify offenders and it doesn't solve crimes. It merely enhances an investigation. It provides more information. You might glean things such as the offender's motive, the relationship between the offender and the victim, and other aspects. And it's not just profiling unknown offenders. You can use criminal profiling for media strategies, for interview strategies, how best to interview an individual and make them vulnerable to you to tell you what you want to know, which is the truth. So there are a lot of different ways to apply behavioral analysis and criminal profiling in criminal investigations.
It sounds a fascinating job to do, and now you host your own podcast, The Consult, with former colleagues and other retired FBI profilers. Why did you decide, Julia, to start your own podcast?
Well, I was encouraged by former agents who I worked with. He said, "Oh, you should do a podcast." And so when I retired, as a gift, my colleagues got me a set of 24 mugs that said The Consult on them. I had a coworker who had named the show and everything, and he had a vision. So that was very inspiring to me. But the real reason behind it was to continue to do the work that we love to do and try to continue to assist in any way that we can in solving cases, not only just in solving cases, but also helping to educate people about what criminal profiling is, what police investigations really look like, and provide information about different concepts about not just profiling, but what police do, what forensic scientists do. So we're continuously trying to provide an educational service as well through our podcast. But I think the bottom line is we loved what we did. We loved working together, and we wanted to continue to do it after we retired. So I decided, let's start a podcast.
Julia, during your time as an FBI profiler, you were given the task of profiling the Golden State Killer. What do you remember about finding out that you'd be taking on this case?
So I was familiar with the case, and at the time, he was not known as the Golden State Killer. We knew him as the East Area Rapist or the original Night Stalker because he hadn't been identified until 2001 as being responsible for the series of sexual assaults up in the Northern California area and the homicides in the Southern California area. So in 2001, when he was finally identified, they kind of combined the two monikers, and he was known as the East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker. And I had watched a documentary about the case, and I hadn't heard about it. And this was a few years after he had been linked to all the crimes through DNA. And I was fascinated with the case. And then when I joined BAU, one day my boss called me into his office, and he had a piece of paper, which I could tell was some sort of communication, and he started to say, "Have you ever heard of the East Area?" And I cut him off, and I said, "East Area Rapist?" And he said yes, because he hadn't heard of the case. It was a case, believe it or not, that really flew under the radar. And I said, "Yes, I have heard of it. I'll take it." And what had happened was the different jurisdictions in California had gotten together. They formed a working group, and they were trying to look at all of the cases together, each agency looking at everybody's investigation to see what they could come up with. Could they somehow link them together? Could they come up with investigative ideas? And one of the ideas was, well, let's have a profile done. And that's how we got involved. And that's how I was assigned the case.
Can you give us a sense, Julia, of how you approach a case like this with so many victims over so many decades and crimes committed in so many different areas?
So I just started chronologically, and the agencies are responsible for pulling together all the case files and sending them to me. So it was really just very well organized, really well done. My main point of contact was Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, and they helped gather everything. And I just started from the very beginning. It's overwhelming. One case could take months and months to do, even just one single homicide or a series of maybe 5 to 10 cases. But this was obviously one of the largest cases that the FBI BAU had ever looked at. And I just started from the beginning and began reading and taking notes and trying to make observations as I went along. And this is all between my other casework too, because this wasn't the only case I had. I did have some other cases. I got through the first 15 incidents, and I started to notice things, and I realized, wait a second, has this been going on since the very first one? So I had to start over again. I had to go back and go through and try to check my theory. Is this what I'm seeing? And then as I started to notice things, you'd have to go back and check, did he do that in that case? Well, why did he do it in this case and not in this case? So that's what I did until I became as familiar with the series as possible. And it took me a long time. It's probably 6 months for me to get through everything to where I felt I had a strong working knowledge of the series.
Joseph DeAngelo started his criminal career as a burglar. Can you talk us through those burglaries?
Sure. So he started in a place called Visalia, California. And these were a series of ransackings where the offender was going into homes, mostly during the day when no one was present, and ransacking the homes, basically going through, opening drawers, throwing things out, making a mess. And occasionally he would steal things. He stole things that were of some value, and he stole things that made no sense, such as he'd steal one earring from a pair of earrings. And this was very prolific. There were over 100 burglaries in this area. And that was one of the things that I had also looked at and had been asked to do. I thought it was really important because some of the investigators believed that the Visalia Ransacker was, in fact, the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker. Other investigators were strongly opposed to that theory. So I thought, as a profiler, looking at the behavior, and we had no forensic evidence to connect Visalia to any of the other crimes. So could I connect them behaviorally? So that was one of the things I looked at. We've since learned that's probably not even where he first started, but those were the cases that I had. I did not have any other series to connect them to. So I thought this is probably where he began his career. And it was very prolific. One of the things that was very significant in these ransackings is that the offender at one point tried to kidnap a high school girl from her home. Her father intervened, and the ransacker shot and killed him. And the weapon that was used was a weapon that had been stolen in a prior burglary. So investigators were pretty certain that the ransacker was also the murderer of Dr. Claude Snelling, the victim's father. And so not only was he a burglar, he at this point had become a murderer already. It went on for approximately 2-year time period. They were very intensive. There were many of them. And the neighborhoods that he was operating in were very similar, like the homes were similar. They were ranch style, single-story California-type homes. Those stopped, and then the series of sexual assaults began about 4 hours from Visalia in Sacramento. So many investigators believe they could be connected. and others thought they were not connected. And largely in part because the witness descriptions of the Visalia Ransacker did not match the descriptions of the East Area Rapist. So I think a lot of people thought they're not the same person.
There were strange things that were taken, weren't there, Julia? And it doesn't sound like it was for monetary reasons. I think one victim reported that her beauty cream was stolen. When you were looking at all this and the odd earring and the bits and pieces that he took, what was your theory as to motivation, and what did that aspect of those burglaries perhaps suggest to you?
So most burglaries are committed for financial gain, by and large. But when you see odd behavior that doesn't make sense, that does not facilitate a financial motivation, then you have to think that there's probably another motivation going on. So when you see symbolic behavior or maladaptive behavior, and that's what we were seeing in the Visalia ransackings. And what was so interesting is that the incident reports for the Visalia ransacking case were very short, sometimes 1 or 2 sentences, because they just considered these sort of nuisance crimes. But there would be little tidbits of information like, oh, that's interesting. Like, oh, she's missing an earring. Or, oh, he poured orange juice on a bed. Oh, he went into the lingerie drawer and cut up a woman's undergarments. Things like that to me suggest there's a sexual motive. And while it's not always obvious where somebody might be acting out on sexual aggression, things like that indicate to me that there might be a sexual motive. While I may not understand what or why somebody gets sexually gratified by something like that, they do. There's something for everyone out there. So that started to suggest to me that there was more going on than just financial gain in these crimes.
Our podcast, True Criminals, is a year old. Thank you to all those on Patreon and to our listeners who followed us over the year and heard stories that have ranged from serial killers like Fred West and Myra Hindley to ongoing mysteries like the disappearance of Madeleine McCann and Lord Lucan, to robbers including Playboy thief Valerio Vice and Great Train mastermind Bruce Reynolds. As a Christmas special, we want to answer your questions about our previous episodes. Ask us anything you want, and Martin and I will try to answer. Send us your thoughts to contact@audiobleachglobal.com.
While you were reviewing the burglaries, Julia, did you see any sort of escalation in behaviour that indicated to you that he might be moving towards more serious crimes like sexual assaults?
Yes, and not within the burglaries themselves, but when he went into the home and kidnapped the high school girl and tried to take her out of the home. Obviously, an escalation, and a significant escalation that seemed to, I don't want to say come out of nowhere, but it certainly indicated that he had more in mind than just to go ransack people's homes. So that was concerning. Something else I noticed within the burglaries was that there was one case where he poured lotion in the hallway on the floor of a home. Some victims would indicate, I'm missing my face cream, or I'm missing lotion, or the lotion was moved. And in another case, they found a fingerprint. I don't know that it was usable for comparison purposes, but they found a fingerprint in lotion. I thought that was interesting. I thought he might be using lubricant for maybe masturbation in these cases. And what was interesting too is that when he committed sexual assaults, in many of those cases, victims reported he used lotion as a lubricant.
What does it tell you, Julia, when you start to see crimes escalate? And what did it suggest was happening perhaps with D'Angelo as you were putting this jigsaw, if you like, together?
Obviously, getting comfortable with what he's doing. He's good at it. He's gotten away with it several times. He moves to a different area, and that might give him an opportunity to escalate as well. He was getting a lot of attention, and pressure in Visalia, so moving to another area and starting there, and people not necessarily putting together that those were connected, it gives him some breathing room. And I think likely, I don't want to say compulsion, because I feel he had control over himself. It wasn't like he couldn't stop, because we know that he did, but he needed more and more to get gratification. And the burglaries were just a stepping stone. And eventually, a burglar like that is often going to escalate to sexual assault. There's a really strong correlation between what I call sexual burglary and sexual aggression. So because you were seeing all of these, what I thought to be sexual components in his burglaries, I thought it would be only a matter of time until an offender like that escalates.
And that he did, of course.
Yes, he did.
Sexually assaulting women in Sacramento and the East Bay areas of Northern California.
Yes.
What was his typical MO in those sex assaults?
So his typical procedure in almost every case, it was exactly the same. I have never come across an offender who was so ritualistic and doing the same thing the same way almost every single time. So what he would do is he would enter through an unlocked sliding door, an unlocked window. Sometimes he'd pry open doors and windows, and on some occasions, investigators believed he'd entered the homes prior to his attack, unlock a door or a window, and then come back later and enter through either the window or the door that he unlocked. He would go into the victims' bedrooms. He'd shine a flashlight in their eyes to blind them. He would tie them up and put blindfolds over their heads, like pillowcases or various items of clothing, to make sure they couldn't see. He began by attacking only women, and then he started attacking male-female couples who were in bed together. And when he would attack couples, he would tie the male, or he would have the female victim tie the male. He would tie the female, and then he would again tie the male. He would separate the victims from each other, take a female into another room. Prior to any sexual assault, in every single case, he would ransack their homes. He would go through their cabinets, their bathrooms, their drawers. He would make a lot of noise. He would eat their food. He would pretend he was gulping their pills and medications. He would always tell the victims that he was just there to rob them. This was a way, I think, to prevent the male victim from taking any action against him, to make him more compliant and complacent. If we just agree and do what he says, he's not going to harm us. But he would often tell the female, I need you to come with me to show me where your purse is. I'm just going to steal your money. And that would be the way that he would separate the female from the male victim. And then after ransacking, he would then sexually assault the female victim. And if he sexually assaulted the female victim multiple times, he ransacked their home in between each assault. One of the things that was also very notable about what he would do is he would place fragile items such as cups and saucers on the backs of the male victims. And he would tell them, if you move, then these will fall off and break, and I'll hear, and then I'll come back and I'll kill you. And his threats were very brutal and gory threats. He threatened to cut off their ears and their fingers. In one case, when children were present in the home, he threatened the children as well. So this is the way he was able to control his victims. So that's generally how he operated. And when I was going through the reports, within just a few sentences of the victim reports, I would know, yes, this is him. He's saying the same things to them. He's doing the same thing. He has the same way. He's committing these crimes each and every time.
Julia, what was the purpose of him eating and gulping the food so loudly, which many of his victims reported?
I think that was a way for him to appear scarier and more dangerous than he really was. And I'm not saying he's not dangerous, but I think this was just a way to show them, I'm just this absolutely out of control, dangerous person. I don't care what I'm going to do. And another thing was to ensure that they heard what he was doing so that they had no doubt that this very powerful, scary, dangerous man was in their home and had total control of their home and their space.
Just reading more of the things he did, Julia, he wore a mask, he blindfolded his victims. I'm just trying to think of you sitting there going through all of these different cases, and you said there that you could see it was the same person, but in your mind, are you building up a picture of this person? And what were your personal thoughts about this horrific attacker?
Well, yes, the whole time I'm building up, okay, what do I think? And one of the things I thought, and you mentioned how he blindfolded them and he wore a mask and he blinded them with his flashlight, all of those things. So he was very careful about not wanting to be seen. He disguised his voice as well. So he was very good about that. And I also thought that his efforts to control, which were not only with the bindings and with the blindfolding, but also with all these over-the-top, brutal, gory threats that he made. While it sounds scary and dangerous, it indicated to me that perhaps he was insecure, and maybe insecure in his own ability to physically dominate. So he had to use these over-the-top methods. So what I started to see is a very insecure type of offender. Maybe these crimes are compensatory for where he feels he's lacking in his real life. And that's what I started to see. And that's the picture that started to emerge as I was going through all these cases.
And maybe, Julia, from reports of people who'd been attacked, perhaps insecure in his own manhood.
Definitely. Yes. And I think there's a misconception. Well, he's attacking male-female couples, and therefore he must be really bold and brazen. And I really thought the opposite. I thought the male victims were not just obstacles that he had to overcome, but really important to his fantasy of feeling powerful, to show I can come in your home and I can go through all your belongings and take control of you and make you powerless, and I can have sexual access to your female companion, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Julia, many of the victims of the sex assaults reported that their attacker had a notably small penis. What did you make of that? And how do you think that influenced his behaviour?
Well, yes, I will say just about every single victim described that aspect of him. And I know that it sounds so obvious and so cliche, but I think this was something that probably contributed to his insecurity and maybe part of the reason why he felt, and I'm not going to say it's the sole reason, but if you want to look for somebody who's trying to prove that he's a man, well, he's dealing with a very, very small penis. And in one case, a victim who was trying to appease him and compliment him so that he wouldn't hurt her. It was her way to cope. And she did tell him that he had a good size penis. And he responded something to the effect of, well, I've been told I have a small penis. So he was aware of it. And I think this was an insecurity for him.
During the time of those sexual assaults, D'Angelo did commit a murder, the murder of Claude Snelling, as you mentioned, towards the beginning of our chat. On September the 11th, 1975, he'd pulled Claude Snelling's 16-year-old daughter Beth out of her bed and forced her from her home. When Claude heard the commotion, he chased them and was ultimately shot and killed by D'Angelo. Was this murder unplanned, do you think, Julia, and happened due to circumstance?
Yes, I think it was unplanned. But what it showed is his ability to react quickly and his ability with a firearm to escalate directly to deadly force, which up to that point, as far as we knew, and as far as I know to this day, he never killed anybody before, but he was extremely effective and efficient when he killed Claude Snelling. But I do think it was unplanned. And the fact that it was unplanned, but it was done so well, told us some things about him.
It was only a few months later, after the Claude Snelling shooting, that he shot at William McGowan after being confronted.
Yes.
But Mr. McGowan survived. D'Angelo also shot at another man, Rodney Miller, who had confronted him in his backyard with his father. And in February 1978, he shot and killed Brian and Katie Maggiore after Brian possibly confronted him while the couple were on a walk. What did you make of those incidents?
What I made of those incidents is that he did not want to have a physical confrontation with another male. That rather than try to fight off another male, he escalated directly to deadly force. He was very comfortable with it. So it indicated to me he was experienced with a firearm, that he did not want to have hand-to-hand combat with another man. He was not confident in his abilities to fight another man, so he was just going to escalate directly to using a gun and a weapon, which he was very good at. And you see that across the board. He's very efficient. And so that's what that told me about him.
Just like he changed his tactics when he began assaulting couples, there was an incident on October the 1st, 1979, in Goleta, California, that you say in your podcast went very wrong for him and was a turning point. Can you tell us what happened and talk us through that incident?
Yes. So he broke into the home and everything was going to plan as it had in the other cases. But in this case, the male victim who was left in the bedroom was able to get up, hop out the back door. And he was in the backyard. He was yelling for help. So D'Angelo, who is in another room with the female victim, goes out of the back looking for the male victim. Meanwhile, the female victim runs out the front door screaming. And so D'Angelo basically has both of his victims going in opposite directions, and they're both screaming. And when he went into the backyard, the male victim was able to hide. And so D'Angelo couldn't find him. So basically, he lost complete control. And for somebody like D'Angelo, who is looking to control and have the ultimate control of his victims, this was a disaster, an absolute disaster. And the neighbor, who happened to be an FBI agent, overhears the commotion. He calls the sheriff's department, and then he proceeds to jump into his own vehicle and chase the offender who's on a bicycle. He ends up losing him. So things just went completely wrong for him. And I think it was a turning point for him, definitely.
After that, he never left anyone alive again, did he?
He didn't.
He went on to murder 10 more people, mostly couples, but one woman who was alone, and there was another 18-year-old who was also alone. Tell us about some of those murders, Julia. What stood out amongst those for you?
Well, the next double homicide, or the double homicide that followed the incident in Goleta, in that case, too, things went wrong as well. Everything looked like it was proceeding to plan. And when the police responded to the crime scene, they found the female victim had been executed in bed, And the male victim was on the floor, and he had been shot as well. And what it appeared to the police is that during his attempts to tie up the victims, the male victim broke free, and D'Angelo had to shoot and kill him right away in a close proximity. And then prior to any ransacking, prior to any sexual assault, he executed the female in bed. And that, again, went very wrong for him. He escaped, but it was extremely high risk. He's shooting a weapon, and it's in close range, and it can draw attention. And so very, very high risk behavior. But that crime did not go well for him either. So I thought, again, for somebody who is wanting to have control over the situation, for him to lose control was probably very difficult for him. So after that, the victims, he ended up killing them. He would go through what it appeared from all the crime scenes and the reports that I read. He went through the same process, and then he would bludgeon his victims to death after he completed his whole routine, is what I would call it. The other very interesting thing that occurred during this time is there was a big gap. And up to this point, his crimes had been fairly close together. But there was a gap between his last two murders between 1982 and 1986, a 4-year gap. And so that was really interesting. There were a lot of things I thought of could be possibly the reason for that. And some investigators thought, well, maybe he was in prison during that time, or maybe he was ill or something. And that was an interesting thing to note within the series of this long period of time where there didn't seem to be any other crimes that were similar.
Just going back to the fact that he started beating some of his victims to death, were there any clues as to why he would do that as opposed to killing them as he had done previously with his firearm?
He would only use his firearm in a situation where he had lost control and where he might have to go engage in hand-to-hand combat with another man. And so in the cases where he bludgeoned his victims, they were helpless. He wasn't fighting them. He was bludgeoning them just to kill them and have what I believe to be the ultimate control. And he was never going to let anyone take control away from him again. So when he would shoot people, this was in a situation where he did not have complete control of the male victim. And it was possible that he could be assaulted. And he wasn't going to let that happen. He obviously didn't trust his own physical abilities to fight another man. And the cases where he bludgeoned them, they were completely helpless and tied up in those cases. They couldn't even fight him.
It demonstrated, I suppose, how violent and physical he could be.
Yes.
Julia, thanks so much for your expert insights on this story so far. And indeed, we look forward to you joining us again for our next episode that will explore the aftermath of this case.
I look forward to that as well. Thank you.
Hearing all of this, Martin, the level of control, the meticulous planning, it's really hard to wrap your head around it. It's so chilling to think that while terrorising communities from the shadows, D'Angelo was living an apparently normal, unassuming, everyday life as a family man.
It doesn't really surprise me that he was able to switch to normality. I think it's just another illustration of his control. He was able to control himself as much as he controlled his victims. I think what's striking is how long he managed to get away with it. For over a decade, this one man committed dozens of rapes and multiple murders across California. Then he vanished without trace. After 1986, everything just stopped. Cases went cold for decades.
It took new technology to finally crack the mystery. Over time, DNA advances linked crimes that were once thought unrelated, until investigators had the evidence they needed. But we'll explore all of that in part 2. Next week, Julia will be back to explain how detectives finally caught Joe D'Angelo and discuss what police learned about what drove the Golden State Killer. Join us then. Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Martin and I haven't even got one of those yet. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.